You're listening to The White Rabbit, conversations on the art of presenting in a rather noisy world. Your hosts are Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. Matt helps leaders of international companies speak, write, and present with confidence. Alper is a communications trainer and a startup investor with a diverse portfolio of companies in Barcelona. If you like this podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. Now, on to Matt and Alper for today's conversation.
Alper, believe it or not, before the podcast today, I was on a website called nutsandbolts.com. And believe it or not,
I have no difficulty believing that.
Yeah.
And that should tell a lot.
That should tell a lot. That before the podcast, Matt was on a website called nutsandbolts.com. And on the website nutsandbolts.com, they sell, surprise, surprise, nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
You would
that makes sense.
So anyway,
that wouldn't be my first guess, though.
Yeah,
Such a good name. I would think of
that is a great name, nutsandbolts.com.
Yeah.
But surprise, surprise, it has been taken by a company selling nuts and bolts. And so what we're going to talk about on the podcast today actually has something to do with something on nutsandbolts.com. So remind me, if I forget, before the end of the podcast, remind me that somehow Matt explained to me what is the tie-in with this website, nutsandbolts.com. So remind me of that, okay?
You can be sure I'm going to do that.
Okay. All right. So the main topic for today is this awful myth that we've heard a gazillion times as presentation trainers. What is it? The 93% of communication is nonverbal or something like that? Is that how the myth goes?
I think that percentage changes every day, like the stock market.
Yeah, sometimes it's always a high number. Sometimes it's 80%, sometimes it's 70%, sometimes it's 63%, sometimes it's 88%.
And it's divided into other categories as well.
Yeah, oh my God. Don't get me started. So, and by the way, we don't want this podcast to get labeled with, explicit language. So whenever I want to use explicit language to rag on this theory, I'm going to need to stop and look for a non-explicit word.
I would be the last person to help you with that because I would probably go down that road way ahead of you.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you would. Okay. So anyway, so this myth, this 93% of communication is nonverbal. First of all, there are so many things wrong with this. But before we get into that, before we get into what's wrong with it, actually there's nothing wrong with the theory. It's just that it's been horrendously misapplied. Yeah. Before we get into that, we as trainers, you and I as trainers, almost invariably, I've found over the years that whenever you're training somebody on this, that issue comes up. Do you find the same thing?
Always. Every single training.
Yeah, every single training, somebody says, yeah, but I've heard that 93% of blah, blah, blah. And then they're like, oh, if I just move my hands in the right way or make the right eye contact or whatever, then suddenly everything's going to be magic and a whole fresh world is going to be opened up for me and I'll be perfect and awesome. And my ideas will never count again because they're only...
I use my body language, yeah.
Yeah, I use my body language to convince everybody of everything. If only life were that simple. So anyway, the study, it was in 1967. It was by this guy named Dr. Marabian or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And he was somewhere in California or something. And the source of that, or the beginning, the actual meaning of that 93% is that this guy was doing a study that if you are saying one thing, but if your body language is saying another thing, then it's not going to come across well because people are looking at your body language and they know that if you say that you're happy, but you look like you're actually massively sad, they're going to say, no, actually, you're not happy. We don't believe you. You look sad. So the 93% is that. It's not.
Don't quote me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's not 93% of all communication is nonverbal. It's just that 93% of communication in that instance is people are going by, okay, do the words match what your body is saying?
Yeah, I was going to say, don't quote me on this, but if I remember correctly, the situation was if there is incongruency or inconsistency between what you are saying and the way your body is showing it. So I think inconsistency or a mismatch would be the prime ingredient for body language or nonverbal communication to not supersede, but to be the major factor in the communication.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. If
it's not my way, by the way. It's something that I read from this research.
Yeah, if what you're saying doesn't match what your body is saying, people aren't going to believe your words.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the thing that this guy was saying. And somehow that message, which is a perfectly good message that pretty much everybody can believe and relate to, somehow that message got blown up into this awful misrepresentation, which is that my words don't matter anymore.
And you should see the slides that go with that message.
Yeah. Okay. So that got me to thinking, if the body language is not a key skill anymore, if it's not 93% of your communication, what are the key skills that you do need to make for a good presentation? And I've come up with a couple, and then I want to get your visual design perspective on a couple skills.
Okay.
How does that sound?
That sounds good.
Okay. So I was thinking the first key skill that you need is the ability to distill your idea into 1 to 3 sentences. And that doesn't mean that you have to simplify your idea until all of the personality is gone. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that the details don't matter anymore. So don't take me out of context on this. But if you've got 10 people in the room, for example, let's talk percentages. If you've got 10 people in the room, for example, only about 3 of them are going to be really detail oriented, 3 or 4. And they're going to want to see data, and they're going to want to see plans, and they're going to want to see numbers, and they're going to want to see all the little details and all the little bullet points, God forbid, all of the little bullet points, all of the little details of your plan. But the other 6 or 7 of them, they've got other things on their mind. And so you're distilling your idea into 1 to 3 sentences for them. When they walk out of the room, that 1 to 3 sentence summary of your idea, that's what's going to need to stick in their head. And so they're going to depend on your ability to take this 20-minute or 30-minute or 18-minute or 15-minute or whatever presentation that you're making and distill it into 1 to 3 sentences so that when they walk out of the room, they understand your idea just by those 1 to 3 sentences. And again, that's not all of the audience, but it's a very large portion of the audience, maybe 60 or 70% of the audience. How does that sound to you?
I would completely agree with that and build up on that in the upcoming minutes. But at the same time, remind you that I'm curious about the connection to the nuts and bolts, just to make sure that you're not off the hook.
Okay.
In terms of the website terminology.
We'll get to that in a second, because nutsandbolts.com, I am not going to forget about, or maybe I am going to forget about that, which is why I've reminded you to remind me about it. But
this podcast is not sponsored by nutsandbolts.com.
This podcast, by the way, is not sponsored by nutsandbolts.com. Okay, so skill number 2. Skill number 2 is that you need the ability to describe your idea to multiple constituencies. To describe your idea to software engineers, to describe your ideas to finance people. And then within those groups, there are going to be subgroups. And because maybe you're walking into the presentation and thinking, oh, these are all finance people. All I need to do is do one description, and all the finance people are going to love me because of it. And that's not true. Because within the finance group, there's accounts payable people, and there's accounts receivable people, and there's people who do forecasting of what sales are going to look like in June. And you need to tailor your message for those subgroups. So don't walk into the room thinking, oh, these people are all from one department. They're all the same. Let's lump them all together. All I need to do is, I can be lazy, and all I need to do is describe my idea in one way to one group of people. So those are the two key skills. One is the ability to distill your message. That's number 1. And then number two is the ability to describe that idea to multiple constituencies, people who care about different things.
I completely agree with both of them and feel a stronger connection to the second one in the ability to take your message and to be able to explain it to people who are not like-minded and who might be representing the complete opposite side of the spectrum. I think is a great skill.
Yeah. So talk to me from a visual design or a slide design perspective. So if I am, for example, let's say that I'm a marketing director or a marketing manager or something, and my boss has peeked his or her head into my office and said, "Oh, you got to give a presentation tomorrow on something." So what are one or two of the key skills that I'm going to need when I'm putting together my slides?
I think they would be in line with what you talked about. Only more about the visual representation. And I think this is something that we have repeated quite a big number of times before, which is trying to make it as simple as possible. Remember your first recommendation, being able to explain it, being able to summarize it. And then the second recommendation, being able to connect with multiple constituents. I don't believe it would happen. You could do it without simplifying it enough. So if the message is simple enough, only then I believe you will be able to reach out to different groups of people.
Okay.
And in doing that, of course, I'm not just talking about simplifying the content on the slides, but also invoking the power of, let's say, vision. And in that regard, I think I would refer to this research that John Medina had written in his book, The Brain Rules.
Sure.
I mean, have you heard that book, by the way?
I've heard of that book, but I've heard of that book, but many of our listeners will not. So feel free to summarize it for us.
Yeah. Well, actually, the book is called Brain Rules by John Medina, and it's talking about 12 rules that govern the functioning of the brain. I have seen it in multiple languages. It's a must read that I recommend to almost everyone that I come across in the trainings. And my biggest take from that book was about the vision and how powerful it is over other senses. And in the book, he was mentioning a research where a test was made on people who were able to remember like more than, 2,500 pictures with at least 90% accuracy, like several days later. And these were not pictures that people were shown for hours. They saw each picture for like 10 seconds.
Okay.
And in contrary, when they were presented with text or words, they remember about 10% after 72 hours after 72 hours. Okay. But here's the key factor to wrap this up in the world of the presentations. If you are able to accompany that message that you present with text or words by a relevant picture or a visual, then the retention rate will suddenly jump up to more than 65%. That's more than 6 times increase, and I think it's the simplest tool to use to increase your effectiveness, especially when you have limited time to make changes or to edit your structure of the presentation. So I would recommend keeping the message simple and accompanying it as much with visuals as possible. And since we're talking about, let's say, quick tips, I would recommend people not to spend too much time searching the internet for all sorts of images. PowerPoint has this feature where you can just search for images directly within the presentation software using keywords. So just look at your slides. If you think that they are crowded, just simplify them and accompany them with visuals. I feel that I have been preaching the same message in the last 10 years and almost in each episode of this podcast, but I think it's one of the strongest ways of increasing the effectiveness of your communication when you're using presentations.
So to sum up, before we get to the nutsandbolts.com and why is Matt on this website? So
tell me.
But before we do that, so to sum up, the body language thing is, well, I don't want to get an explicit label for the language in this podcast.
Calm.
So it's
breathe, take a deep breath.
Take a deep breath and
Calm
just use
down.
the word junk.
Yeah.
So this idea of 93% is just junk. The research itself was great, but somehow it has become horrifically misappropriated and misused and misrepresented. So it is not an excuse to just be a pretty monkey up there on stage dancing around, and suddenly, because your body motions are perfect, everybody's going to support you. That's not what it means at all. So yes, words are important again. And what you're saying here with the graphics is that the graphics are even more important than the words. So the words are important, but the graphics are also extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
So now to nutsandbolts.com, and what does it have to do with presentations? The thing that I wanted to mention is, we've talked about the importance of words on this podcast today.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that I was on nutsandbolts.com is there's this bolt that I love. There's a geek statement for you. There's a bolt that I love. How could you be more geeky than that? But anyway,
carefully there.
The reason that I was on nutsandbolts.com is that I had this image in my head of what this bolt looked like, but I couldn't think of the name. Mm-hmm. And the name, it turns out, is drywall anchor bolt. And a drywall anchor bolt is one of those bolts.
I like those, actually.
Yeah.
Would that make me a geek too?
Yeah. Well, we've established long ago that you were also a geek. But yes,
okay.
That would definitely make you a geek, is liking drywall anchor bolts. So anyway, for those who are not familiar with drywall anchor bolts, they're the kind of bolts that, first of all, the part of them collapses, kind of like an alligator's mouth or a crocodile's mouth. Mm-hmm. And you push the bolt into an empty space. And then when the mm-hmm. bolt reaches an empty space, the jaws of the alligator open up mm-hmm. and form an anchor. So if you try to pull the bolt out, the bolt will not come out anymore because it is anchored by the open jaws of the alligator or the open mm-hmm. jaws of the crocodile. And what that has to do with words is that the words that you are using in your presentation, they are like this drywall anchor bolt. And they go into the heads of your audience members. And once they are inside of the audience member's head, they open up and they take life. They take a life that they did not have there, or they take a life that they did not have when you put them in there. And mm-hmm. so that's why I was on this website, nutsandbolts.com, is that I wanted to learn the name of this bolt called drywall anchor bolt.
Drywall anchor.
Yeah.
By the way, even if we were sponsored by these guys, I don't think we would have mentioned their names so frequently in one single episode.
Yeah, it's like this is probably the best press that they've ever got. Because right now there's somebody in Barcelona and somebody in Turkey saying the name nutsandbolts.com.
And yet here we go again, one more time.
Yeah, one more time. And they're saying it a gazillion times, and they're not advertising, but it's probably the best press that these people have ever gotten.
Yeah.
And on that note, we should probably wrap it up for today.
Yeah.
Okay, so to sum up, this 93%, it's junk science. It's great science, but it has been horrifically misappropriated, horrifically mm-hmm. misrepresented. Mm-hmm. So it is not an excuse to just learn the skills of body language. Your words and your graphics, your images still are immensely important. Is that a fair summary of
that is? And I think we can even dig deeper.
Uh-huh.
Not now, but in future episodes, I think we can do that.
Sure, of course. There's always room to dig deeper. Okay, so that's it for this week. Thank you very much, Alper.
All right,
and
good talking to you.
Talk to you next week then.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The White Rabbit with Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or through your favorite feed.